which has the power to wipe out the millions of people who live within its reach. It's killed before. It can kill again. Deep in the bottom layers, the water holds a sinister secret. A secret that scientists can only unravel by solving the puzzle of what turns a normal lake into a killer. It was in Cameroon in West Africa in 1984 that a killer lake was first discovered. Early that morning, like every morning, Haji Abdu was making the journey to his farm. But it was a day he would never forget.
I thought it was a car accident. I stopped my bicycle and I stood still. I saw dead people all over the road. I knew something terrible had happened here. I thought I was going to die.
Within hours, 37 people would be found dead. Strange stories of how they had died were reaching the nearby village.
We heard there were massacres. Two guys came running and told us, we don't know what it is, but it kills people. They told us there were 12 people in the truck and 10 of them died. We asked them how did they die. They told us we were sitting on the top of the truck, a pickup. The others were under the cover. The driver was the first to get out and see what was wrong with his engine, and he fell. The rest of the men in the back decided to get out and died. You understand?
It seemed like everyone had died without a struggle. There were rumors of a highly contagious disease. The first doctor on the scene was Pierre Zambou, but he was not prepared for what he was about to see.
People were afraid. We had never seen anything like it before. People lying dead on the road, like the coffee would dry on the drying sheds.
People were terrified the infection would spread.
We had no mask, nothing, no gloves either. We used our bare hands. We put them in the military jeeps and left.
Death had come so suddenly. The victims looked as if they had been asphyxiated. But by what? The mystery deepened. Some survivors had caught a glimpse of the killer.
We saw a cloud, a thick white cloud, a few feet away from us. In an instant, it was gone.
This was the first clue, a deadly white cloud. And the killer had left a second, more important clue.
When we got up there, we passed someone who was fleeing, who told us, "You are going to die, you're going to die. Something smells bad up there."
It was a strange white cloud that smelled of rotten eggs. Scientist Haraldur Sigurdsson was sent by the American government to investigate the bizarre events at Manoon. When he went down to the lake to look for clues, he couldn't believe his eyes. The water had changed color. What Sigurdsson had in front of him was a red lake. Whatever this was, he was convinced that it must have something to do with the lake. But what was it? There was only one way to find out for sure. Carry out some experiments on the lake itself.
But we had really no idea what was in the lake. And when we got out on it, on a little boat, it was scary. We had really no idea whether the lake was safe to be on, and so it was an uneasy feeling.
At the deepest point of the lake, he stopped and took samples of the sediment from the very bottom. Slowly, he pulled them up.
As we were hauling them in, and when they were getting closer to the surface, we see that they're bursting with gas. Huge bubbles are coming up. And then I immediately realized that the deep waters of the lake are saturated with a gas.
A gas he couldn't see, taste, or smell. Sigurdsson suddenly realized there was only one gas it could be. A gas that all of us breathe out. A gas that is harmless in small amounts, but lethal in high concentrations.
Carbon dioxide. It was clear to me then that carbon dioxide was the asphyxiating agent, the deadly agent that had led to the disaster in Monoon.
There was now a real mystery. Something was forcing huge quantities of carbon dioxide out of the lake and pushing the iron sediment to the surface. But before he had time to find an explanation, the killer struck again.
Hundreds of people have died in a natural disaster in the West African state of Cameroon.
A deadly natural gas has left at least 1,200 people dead.
The tragedy at Lake Nyos 2 years later, in 1986, stunned the world. Another lake in Cameroon was linked to mysterious deaths. But this time, the extent of the damage was so vast, the news could not be suppressed.
I went down to Nyos. There was no people. Everybody was dead.
Entire villages were decimated, filled with corpses and dead cattle. There was no sign of panic. People had fallen dead while sleeping or cooking. They seemed to have been suffocated with all their animals. The death toll was staggering. 1,800 people had perished. It was 50 times more deadly than Monoon. But miraculously, there were some survivors. When Monica Ngong regained consciousness, she found herself amid the horrific aftermath of the disaster.
I was just sitting among the dead people. Inside the house, some of them were outside, some of them behind the houses. Animals everywhere, lying, fowls, dogs, cows, everything. So I was confused by then. All the family, we were 56, but 53 died.
By the time the emergency services got to the scene, all traces of a gas cloud had vanished. But the killer had once again left a trail of important clues.
The thing was white like cloth. It didn't go up in the air. It mostly went down near the ground.
We heard a loud sound, just like explosion. I went outside and saw all my cows lying on the ground. I went back inside and saw my wife and daughter had fallen and were lying near a drum of water.
And just like at Monoon, the deadly cloud of gas had left a familiar calling card.
There was a smell like gunpowder.
Those who survived the gas had strange marks all over their bodies.
When I wake up, I had burns on my left hand. By then I was feeling no pains. The arm was even in a way that it was nearly having rotten because of the wounds.
The deaths had happened over a vast area, embracing the villages of Cha, Nyos, and Subum. And the investigators knew that the last body had been found nearly 18 miles away from Lake Nyos. That meant that a colossal amount of gas, over 250,000 tons, must have come out of the lake and flooded the valley. There was only one natural event that could account for these strange effects, and create an explosion that released vast quantities of a smelly gas that burnt the people it touched. Nios was no ordinary lake. It concealed a deadly secret. It was sitting in the mouth of a volcano. And it was the same for Manoon. Both these crater lakes were formed on top of a volcanic chain, which ends at the still active Mount Cameroon. The search for the culprit was over.
The poison gas came up from a volcano beneath the waters of Lake Nios in the remote northwest of the country.
At least 1,200 people are reported dead in Cameroon, the victims of a poisonous gas leak from a volcanic lake.
Poisoned by a sudden release of gas from a volcano lying beneath a lake.
No one could predict when the volcano would erupt again. The Cameroonian government had no choice. They decided to evacuate anyone living within 18 miles of the lake. Thousands of refugees were forced to leave their homes and were resettled in villages away from the threat of the lake. Their old homes were destroyed to stop them from returning. Nios was abandoned. But what no one knew was that new evidence was to be uncovered, evidence which would lead everyone on a journey into the unknown. Americans were among the first on the scene. For these scientists, what started as an ordinary investigation would end in an extraordinary discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of how crater lakes kill. They would begin to understand the most intimate mysteries of the monster, deep inside the lake. And for the first time, find a way to tame it. Their first glimpse of the lake was puzzling. And for George Kling, who had been to the site just a year before, it was something of a shock.
Well, I had a picture in my mind of what the lake was like when I was here about a year earlier. Beautiful blue mountain lake. And the lake was completely transformed. There were mats of floating vegetation strewn across this really muddy red water. And there were dead cattle through the valleys.
But what in nature has the power to produce such havoc and death? Only a volcano could change the lake beyond all recognition.
Well, when we first arrived, everything seemed to point to a volcanic eruption. First, there was the fact that the lake occupies a volcanic crater. Second, there was the scale of the disaster. And third, there was the burns on some of the victims. All of that seemed to be consistent with the volcanic eruption.
But as they walked around the top of the crater, they realized that if it really was a volcanic eruption, it looked like a very strange one indeed.
We walked around looking for any evidence of volcanic activity, lava flows or steam beds, sediment that had been recently thrown up from the lake. And really, we found none of that. There was no evidence that there was a large volcanic event or eruption that had just occurred, and that led us to feel that the next thing was to go out on the lake itself.
A closer look at Lake Nios, the killer lake that had recently taken the lives of 1,800 nearby residents.
We were too busy to be frightened. We set out sort of numbed by everything around us and what we were seeing and the idea that so many people had been killed. We just focused on the work. The amount of damage almost put you in shock. You just couldn't believe what you were seeing. This entire cliff here looks normal today, but was completely denuded. All of the vegetation, all the soil was just washed off. And it was really, had to be a tremendous amount of energy to do that.
Whatever had happened here had caused a massive wave of destruction.
The damage extended to about 80 to 100 meters above the level of the lake. So water had definitely passed over at least that high, gone down the other side of the promontory, and created a large wave in the entire southern end of the lake. It had washed up, and on the way back, the water brought vegetation, trees, grasses, lots of plant material back into the lake. At the same time, on the other side of the lake, there was almost no damage. So the damage was heavily focused in this corner of the lake, suggesting a gas jet out of the lake, which is very consistent with a volcanic eruption from beneath the lake.
So they carried out the standard tests for signs of a volcanic eruption in the water itself. The first thing they set out to measure was a change in water temperature. A volcano should be so hot, the water should still be warm, very warm. That was to be their first surprise. They were expecting a huge increase in temperature of 10 to 30 degrees. Bill Evans and George Kling were stunned. The temperature of the water was normal. So they carried out more tests. This time they were looking for sulfur and chloride, which are very common in volcanic eruptions.
Well, one of the most interesting things was that many of the survivors reported smelling rotten eggs or gunpowder, and that's an unmistakable sulfur gas. But when we looked in the water, we could not find any sulfate or any chloride, very small amounts, which didn't fit.
Where had the sulfur and chloride gone? The volcano theory just didn't make sense.
It was so strange, all of the evidence that we were coming up with was really a lack of evidence for a volcanic hypothesis.
But if a volcano wasn't responsible for the tragedy, then what was? What else could have caused the damage around the lake and explain the strange smell and the burns? What exactly was hidden in the depths of the lake? The clue would come from the only other lake that had killed, Lake Monoon, and it would change everything. Back in the U.S., Haraldur Sigurdsson was still analyzing his gas samples to try to piece together what had caused this tragedy. He was trying to find out where the gas actually came from. The first surprise was that the CO2 had none of the characteristics of a volcano. When he analyzed it further, the results were surprising. Carbon leaves different fingerprints in a gas, depending on where it comes from. Plants leave one kind of fingerprint, volcanoes another. But this was something else. It wasn't coming from vegetation. It was carbon-13, a particular form of carbon found deep within the Earth itself. The lethal gas found at the bottom of Lake Monoon could not have come from a volcano. It was seeping slowly up through cracks in the Earth's crust, but was getting trapped at the bottom. Sigurdsson came up with an amazing new explanation.
The lake is rather like a bottle of soda in a way, with the gas coming in, but the gas isn't forming bubbles in the deep water because there's so much weight of water on the gas that it is dissolved inside the water. We don't see the gas. Now, of course, if you release the pressure, you get the gas coming out. This is what happened at Lake Monoon.
Just like in a bottle of soda, the gas dissolved in the lake is under pressure. And just like a bottle of soda, it could explode out of the top. But in this case, the soda bottle was a huge lake. No one had ever described such a strange and potentially lethal event. When Sigurdsson published his paper, it sent shockwaves throughout the scientific community.
I realized that the only explanation that was viable was the carbon dioxide burst, that the carbon dioxide was coming out of the deep water. And other scientists wouldn't accept this. This was such an outrageous, novel, iconoclastic idea that it was very difficult for them to accept.
Sigurdsson called his theory the lake overturn theory. A huge bubble of deadly gas trapped on the floor of the lake, exploding to the surface, forming a cloud that kills all in its path. Could this also explain what happened at Lake Nyos?
The idea that a lake itself could have done this didn't really fit with anyone's expectations. Lakes don't kill people. People may drown, but they just don't explode and kill people. And so it was a little bit of a leap to go from a relatively easy explanation of a volcanic eruption to something that no one had ever heard of before.
It sounded extraordinary, but Bill Evans and George Kling decided to put Sigurdsson's theory to the test. Could there be carbon dioxide trapped at the bottom of Lake Nyos?
See what we got. Whoa, look at that.
When we brought the first samples up from the bottom and they literally exploded out of the sampler because there was so much gas in them, we knew that it was the lake itself. It was not a volcano. It was a completely different and new kind of eruption.
But how could massive amounts of carbon dioxide be getting into the lake? They started picking up on stories from the local people. Stories of magical springs that kill frogs and small birds. Bill and George decided to go and look for these magical springs. As soon as they found them, they knew they were in the right place. And there was something else. Bubbles of gas in the water. When they tested the water, they discovered there were bubbles of carbon dioxide. What they had stumbled upon were carbon dioxide springs. And the amounts of CO2 in the water were alarming. Could these springs be the very piece of evidence that they had been looking for? The source of the gas, and the explanation for the buildup.
You can visualize a spring such as this on the bottom of the lake, feeding the lake for 100 years. And given 100 years, there's enough buildup of that CO2 to cause the eruption.
The theory seemed to make sense, but they couldn't be sure until they compared their samples from the springs to those of the lake. The results they got were beyond their expectations. It was an exact match.
We realized that's it. The springs are the source of the gas into the bottom of the lake. One of these soda springs, or maybe many of them, were feeding CO2 into the bottom of the lake.
They'd struck gold. Now they could start formulating their theory. Springs like these pump vast amounts of CO2 into the water at the bottom of the lake. As more and more carbon dioxide is pumped into the bottom of the lake, the gas concentration rises, turning the lake into nothing less than a huge chemical time bomb, just waiting for the one event that would trigger it to explode. They had to figure out what that trigger was. Triggered the carbon dioxide at the bottom of Lake Nyos to rise up and emit the lethal gas that killed so many. There was some evidence on the cliffs around Lake Nyos itself. One side of the crater had a strange scar that had appeared at the same time as the disaster. These were the telltale signs of a landslide.
In 1986, there was evidence of a landslide right in that area ahead of you that's shaped sort of like a V. All that material was had freshly fallen into the lake, probably hundreds of tons of rock and mud, slid down from that area down into the lake.
Could this be the trigger they were looking for?
The lake here is very steep, so it's conceivable that that slide could have continued all the way down to the bottom of the lake, delivering energy to deeper layers and starting kind of a chain reaction, eventually leading to the disaster.
It seemed they had found the fuse that lit the bomb and turned the lake into a killer. The scientists now had all the clues they needed to explain what happened that night at Lake Nyos and why 1,800 people had died. 17 years later, the full story can now be told. Just before 9 p.m., the villagers prepared for bed for the last time. It was the night before market, so the village of Nyos was packed with people. At the far corner of the lake, the tragic events unfold. A landslide unleashes hundreds of tons of rock into the lake. The rocks and soil move through the water until they reach and penetrate the layer where carbon dioxide is dissolved. This starts to release carbon dioxide. Bubbles of gas travel up to the surface. This cloud of bubbles moves sideways across the lake, picking up speed. Water droplets form on the surface of the gas, turning it into a white cloud. After a few hours, the crater is full, and a dense cloud of gas pours over the lip of the spillway, bearing down on the villagers at over 37 miles per hour. In the village of Nyos, the death toll will be almost complete, with less than 1% of the villagers surviving. The gas rushes in, catching them unaware. Anyone near the ground will be most at risk. The gas creeps over those sleeping in their beds, suffocating them in their sleep. The deadly gas cloud travels on to neighboring villages. For 1,800 people, death is now inevitable. Inside the lake itself, the turbulence caused by the landslide is eating down like a slow-burning fuse, closer and closer to the bottom, where the gas concentration is at its highest. An avalanche process is triggered, and finally the gassy water explodes in a huge fountain of water and foam, more than 300 feet above the lake's surface. This is the explosion some of the survivors heard and thought was a volcano. The huge jet drags enough water with it to produce a tidal wave 82 feet high that races across the shore with enough force to strip it to bare rock and drag vegetation back into the water with it. The water turns red as dissolved iron is sucked up to the surface. At this point, for some unknown reason, the turbulence eating down into the bottom of the lake stops, and no more gas is released. The lake overturn theory seemed to explain everything that happened that night in August. Everything except the two remaining medical mysteries. What exactly was the mysterious smell? The best explanation is that very high concentrations of carbon dioxide can produce hallucinations in which people smell strange things. But the biggest puzzle was the strange burns and blisters left on the bodies of the victims. These burns were to prove one of the disaster's enduring mysteries, and one of the last to be solved. How had these victims come to be so terribly scarred? When British doctor Peter Baxter saw the wounds, he was baffled.
We were really very puzzled as to distribution of these ulcers and burns on the skin, and the fact that they didn't look like normal burns. In one victim who died, the blisters were all over the body.
This was very strange. Lake overturn showed that the villagers were asphyxiated by carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide doesn't burn. Then Peter Baxter realized that there is a gas that might provide an explanation. A gas that's a much more common poison: carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide puts people into a coma and causes blisters and burns by reducing circulation to the skin. Now Dr. Baxter wondered, could the same be true of carbon dioxide?
When we talked to the survivors, it was clear that the carbon dioxide mixed with air had acted as a kind of anesthetic to send people to sleep and put them into coma. Lying for many hours and not moving could result in a sluggish circulation in the skin, so that it's possible that the effects could be due to a lack of oxygen getting to the skin, with this blistering ulceration reaction occurring as a result.
Suddenly, it became clear to Peter Baxter that the people in Cameroon didn't have burns or blisters. They had pressure sores. The mystery of Lake Nyos was finally over. Now that the scientists had worked out what had unleashed the monster from the depths of the lake, they had to make sure it could never happen again.
This lake really is a time bomb. The gas that comes into this lake every day increases the danger of an eruption. So unless steps are taken to remove that gas, it's almost a certainty that the lake would erupt again.
In the end, they came up with a solution that was remarkably simple. It was just like putting a straw into a bottle of soda. But they had to put that straw into a killer lake. In January 2001, a team of French and Cameroonian scientists decided to take the risk and install a pipe in Lake Nyos. As the valve was opened, the pressure of the gas forced a plume of water 164 feet into the air. The lake was exploding again, but this time, the scientists were in control. But the killer lake has not yet been tamed.
With just this one pipe alone, the calculations show that it would take close to 15 years or more just to remove the quantity that is presently stocked at the bottom of the lake. And that's why we've gone ahead and suggested very strongly that we need more pipes. We have to make sure we bring the gas levels to acceptable limits within the shortest time possible.
At least now there is some hope that the villagers will be able to reclaim their homes. Once the scientists understood Lake Overturn, they scoured the world looking for other lakes that could turn into killers. There was just one, Lake Kivu in Rwanda. The volcano was just a warning. The whole area was becoming unstable. Lake Kivu sits on top of a giant rift valley, which was being pulled apart. In the aftermath of the eruption, a huge crack had opened up at the side of the volcano. It formed a vertical tunnel carrying huge amounts of boiling lava, deeper and deeper underneath the lake.
The danger is not going to come from above. It's going to come from below, beneath the lake, lava pouring into the bottom. And we know that that's happened in the past. We know that there have been great releases of gas in the past. And so Energy input from the bottom is what we have to watch for.
The scientists knew that unlike Nios, this time the danger would come not from above, but from below. As the cracks from the volcano get bigger, the trigger gets closer and closer to the bottom layers, where the gas concentration is at its highest. What they fear is that the combined explosive forces of carbon dioxide and methane would produce a tragedy on an unimaginable scale.
There's a double whammy really associated with that gas. The methane would come out of solution first, and the methane at high enough concentrations is explosive, so there would be large explosions above the lake. That would be followed by the CO2 gas, which would move out off of the lake, where it would suffocate people living around the shores.
It is now crucial that something be done.
Well, this would be a tragedy that would just dwarf the Nios event. Nios, about 1,800 people were killed. In the Lake Kivu Basin, possibly 2 million people could be killed by an overturn of Lake Kivu.
The safest option might be the one that benefits everyone. Remove the methane on a vast scale, and in doing so, remove the lethal carbon dioxide. Someone has to find a way of degassing the lake on a massive scale.
Piping the gas out of Kivu is going to be a real challenge.
We can't predict when a volcanic eruption would occur and trigger an overturn. And even if we could, there's no way that we could stop it. We can't keep the rift from pulling apart.
Only after Lake Kivu has been completely degassed can the people of Rwanda be sure they have tamed the killer that hides deep at the bottom of the lake.
This has been a presentation of TLC and the BBC, world-class television.